Imagine a plant that survives under conditions where everything else dies. A plant that can endure months without water, years in poor light, the air in your apartment that dries out your skin, but not its leaves. Millions of people keep it at home, but almost none of them have ever seen it bloom. And that's where the mystery begins. Because the flowering of Zamioculcas is not just a rare event. It's an event that most people don't even believe is possible. People look at their Zamioculcas for 10 years and think, okay, it's just a green plant that grows slowly, but they don't know that they're actually keeping their Zamioculcas on the edge of a miracle. And today we're going to figure out what that miracle is and why it almost never happens. When I started investigating this story, the first thing that struck me was the contrast. On one hand, Zamioculcas is considered an unkillable plant. Beginners in plant care often buy it specifically to avoid their first plant murder. Specialists recommend it to offices and hospitals because it survives human forgetfulness. People have written me comments, "I didn't water it for 2 years, and it's still alive." But on the other hand, no one knows how to truly awaken it. How to make a humble green plant suddenly produce a flower. And this creates a sense of paradox. A plant that's impossible to kill, but almost impossible to bloom. Why? The answer lies on a different continent, in a different climate, in conditions completely unlike your bedroom. Zamioculcas comes from East Africa, from Tanzania, where it has never left in the wild. There, in warm areas with a harsh climate, this plant evolved under conditions of extreme water scarcity and unpredictable rainfall. Over thousands of years of evolution, Zamioculcas became the perfect survivor. In its roots and stems is an entire water storage system, like reservoirs. The thick leaves, covered with a protective layer, aren't beauty, they're defense. Every cell of its leaf is structured to minimize water loss. And when European and American plant collectors discovered this botanical marvel machine at the end of the 19th century, they immediately understood. This is the perfect office plant. Because an office is like an African savanna. Air conditioning dries out the air. People forget to water plants. Windows are far from the desk. The conditions aren't ideal. But Zamioculcas grows, slowly but surely, as if nothing unusual is happening. And here's the thing. When you brought this plant from Africa to your home, you created perfect survival conditions for it, but the opposite of what's needed for reproduction. Many cultures that have long grown Zamioculcas on their lands ascribe special significance to its flowering. According to some Asian traditions, if Zamioculcas starts to bloom in your home, it means a time of change is coming, a period of gratitude, when the plant is essentially thanking its owner for care. In some African cultures, it's believed that the plant's flowering is connected to harmony in the house, to the idea that the energies in your home are in perfect balance. There's a belief that Zamioculcas, as a protective plant, can only bloom when a certain spiritual purity is achieved around it. Of course, this is a poetic way of saying the same thing that science says, but in a completely different language. Now let's move to the scientific part, which explains all of this from a botanical perspective. Zamioculcas blooms in nature every year, like any adult plant. In Africa, this happens in a certain season, usually spring or summer. When the rains have ended, the soil is moist but not waterlogged, and the temperature is optimal. The flower of Zamioculcas is not what you'd expect. It's not a rose, not a tulip, not even anything bright. It's a tiny, almost invisible flower, yellow or cream-colored, sitting on a spike that looks like a miniature corn cob. It's such a modest flower that many people don't even notice it, even if it's happening right in front of them. But here's the botanical miracle. Zamioculcas only starts to bloom when 3 key conditions are present. First, the plant must be old enough. Not a young seedling, but a fully developed plant with a good root system. This can take several years. Second, a dormancy period. In nature, Zamioculcas experiences drought. This triggers a biological mechanism in the plant. Danger? Water is scarce. Time to reproduce while I'm still alive. When drought occurs, the plant invests energy not in new leaves, but in flowering. It's the species' survival strategy. Third, favorable conditions after dormancy. When the drought ends, in the form of good watering and improved conditions, the plant receives the signal, time to make a flower. That's why Zamioculcas almost never blooms in your home, because you create paradise for it. You water it when the soil dries. You keep it in stable, gentle conditions where there's no stress, no drought, no signal to reproduce. The plant is happy, it lives, it grows, but it sees no reason to bloom. Why reproduce if life is already perfect? It's like a person living in complete safety and prosperity. They have no reason to seek something new, and there may be no dramatic changes in their life. See how science manages to explain the same thing that traditions explained. In spiritual traditions, they said, blooming happens when balance is achieved, when there is harmony. Science says, blooming happens when a plant has experienced stress, developed fully, and received a new impulse to grow. The words are different, but the essence is roughly the same. Both traditions understood that flowering isn't just a beautiful event. It's the result of a certain path, certain conditions, and certain readiness. Now for the practical part. How do you make your Zamioculcas bloom? First, check if it's old enough. If your plant is less than 3 or 4 years old, don't panic. It's still young. Second, give it a period of dryness. Water normally in spring and summer, but reduce watering in autumn. Keep the plant in cooler conditions, not near heating, preferably around 15 to 18 degrees Celsius if possible, for at least a month. This mimics drought. Third, after this period, return to normal care. Increase watering and make sure the plant gets enough light. Then there's a chance that flower spikes will appear on the plant. But here's what's important to remember. Zamioculcas blooming is not a guarantee. Even if you do everything right, the plant might bloom only once every few years. Because it's not the same plant as in nature. It's adapted to home conditions, and its natural rhythms are disrupted. And in this, I think, lies all the beauty of Zamioculcas. It's a plant that traveled from the wild African savanna to your apartment and learned to live by new rules. It became so adapted, so ready for any conditions, that it lost the reason to bloom. But when Zamioculcas does bloom, it's a moment when it briefly remembers its African nature. It's a moment when a plant that learned to survive in any conditions suddenly decides, I'm ready to continue my lineage. I've lived long enough. I've survived enough. Now it's time for something new. And maybe it's not just about the plant. Maybe Zamioculcas blooming teaches us that prosperity and stability are good. But sometimes we need stress, we need challenges, we need difficult times to remember why we live. To remember that we're capable of so much more. But wait, because here's where a completely different story begins. Because throughout our entire discussion of why Zamioculcas doesn't bloom in home conditions, I haven't told you the most important thing. There are people who have seen Zamioculcas bloom, and not just once. There are collectors who specialize in making this plant bloom. And their methods are far more complex than simply reduce watering. Because there's one thing that scientists discovered quite recently, Zamioculcas responds to very specific signals, not just cold and dryness. We're talking about a precise sequence of conditions, a combination of temperature, air humidity, photoperiod length, and even light quality. Some researchers have noticed that Zamioculcas is sensitive to light spectrum. This means that if you light it with a regular household bulb, it's completely different from the natural light of African sun. Natural light contains the full spectrum, and the plant responds to it differently. That's why a plant on a windowsill has a better chance of blooming than a plant in a corner under a lamp. But that's not all. There's another factor that few people consider. Zamioculcas is a plant that reproduces through tubers. This means that inside its root system are nutrient reserves that the plant accumulates over years. And here's what's interesting. For a flower to appear, the plant needs to have sufficient reserves of these nutrients. If your Zamioculcas is young, weak, or if you've recently moved it, or if the soil is nutrient poor, then even if you create ideal blooming conditions, the plant will simply say, sorry, but I don't have the strength for this. It's like a person who is exhausted and hungry. Even if you tell them, everything is fine now, have children, they'll answer, I need to recover first. That's why experienced collectors make sure the plant has received enough nutrition before attempting to trigger blooming. They use special fertilizers rich in potassium and phosphorus, exactly the elements responsible for blooming. They feed the plant for several months before the drought period to accumulate energy, and only then do they begin their experiments. And here's where another paradox emerges. The better you care for Zamioculcas, the stronger and healthier it becomes, the higher the probability that it will bloom. But on the condition that you then give it a period of stress. The plant must be simultaneously strong and exhausted, healthy and frightened, satiated before hunger. It's not just about watering and temperature. It's about understanding the psychology of the plant at the level of its biology. It's about thinking like Zamioculcas, about anticipating what it needs, in what order it needs it, and for how long. I spoke with several experienced plant growers who successfully achieved Zamioculcas blooming at home. And each of them said roughly the same thing. It didn't happen the first time. I tried year after year, changed conditions, experimented, and eventually something worked. One collector from the Netherlands shared his story. He had 5 Zamioculcas plants, and he treated them differently. One stood on a windowsill with bright light, another in semi-shade. One he watered rarely, another more frequently. One he gave fertilizer, another he didn't. And after 3 years, a miracle happened. One of the plants, the one he had grown in the harshest conditions, with minimal watering but maximum light, produced flower spikes. But what surprised him most was this. The blooming lasted only a few days. The flower was so modest and inconspicuous that if he hadn't been watching carefully, he would have simply missed it. This made me think about the very nature of Zamioculcas blooming. Why does the plant need such a modest, invisible flower? Why didn't it develop bright, showy flowers like other plants that want to attract pollinators? The answer lies in the history of its evolution in Africa. In the dry conditions of the savanna, bright flowers are a luxury a plant can't afford, because to produce bright petals requires a lot of water, lots of nutrients, lots of energy. And in drought conditions, that means death. Zamioculcas chose a different strategy. Instead of attracting pollinators with brightness, it attracts them with scent. Its flower emits a faint, barely perceptible scent that attracts certain insect species. This is much more energy efficient. The plant expends minimal resources but still reproduces. And when this plant came to your home, it retained this strategy. The flower remained modest, almost invisible. The plant forgot how to be a bright star. It remembers only how to survive. But you know what? There's one more point I wanted to reveal because it explains a lot about why Zamioculcas became so popular in the modern world. In recent decades, Zamioculcas has become a symbol. Not just a plant, but a symbol. Especially in countries where people spend most of their time in offices, indoors under artificial light, in air-conditioned air. Zamioculcas became a symbol that even in such conditions, you can grow something alive. Something that will grow no matter what. I've seen Zamioculcas in Silicon Valley offices, in London banks, in Tokyo hospitals, in Moscow schools. The same plant everywhere. The same story everywhere. It's an unkillable plant. You can forget to water it for months, and it will still be alive. And people loved it not for its flowers. People loved it because it reminded them of themselves. It survives in harsh conditions. It doesn't require much attention. Solid, durable, reliable. But here's the irony. The more people value Zamioculcas for its durability, the less chance it has of ever blooming. Because people continue to keep it in the same harsh conditions that allow it to survive, but don't allow it to flourish. Your Zamioculcas lives in your home, and thanks to you, it's almost impossible to destroy. That's because you give it safety. But if you want to see its true power, if you want to see what it's capable of in the depths of its botanical nature, give it a challenge. Give it a period of cold, give it a period of dryness. But first, make sure it has accumulated enough strength. Feed it, support it, and then give it stress. Maybe it will bloom. Maybe you'll see those little yellow flowers, and they'll be so inconspicuous that you almost miss them. But in that moment, you'll understand something important. You'll understand that even in a plant that seems lifeless at first glance, even in one of the most modest plants on earth, there's a miracle. There's a life force that waits for its moment, that waits for the chance to express itself. And maybe that means something for you too. Maybe it means that sometimes we need to let ourselves become a little exhausted to understand what we're truly capable of. That we need not just security but challenge. Not just support but testing. Because life isn't just about survival. Life is about flourishing. If you love this story about a plant that survived extreme conditions to bring beauty to your home, write in the comments. Have you ever seen Zamioculcas bloom? Or maybe you'll dare to give your plant a challenge and see what happens. Maybe you have your own Zamioculcas that has already endured all kinds of hardship and is waiting for its moment? Like this video if this mystery intrigues you, and subscribe to the channel, because every plant in your home holds its own story, and we'll be uncovering them together. We talk about plants that teach us lessons about life, about survival, about what it really means to flourish even in the most unfavorable conditions. And if you have your own experience growing Zamioculcas, if you've achieved its blooming or if you've been trying to do this for years, I really want to hear your story. Write it in the comments. Because every story is part of a larger mosaic that shows us how plants and people are connected in the search for meaning, beauty, and the possibility of flourishing even in the most unsuitable conditions. Thank you for being with me on this journey. Until we meet again.